Just a heads up, this episode is written by John Livingston. You can find more of his writings over at The Troubles Archive on Instagram, where he writes about a multitude of things related to the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This is the second of a two-part episode, so I would definitely recommend listening to the previous episode before jumping into this one. In the last episode, we learned about how the loyalist paramilitary group, the UDA, had restructured in the early 90s and were carrying out significant attacks on the Catholic population. Steve McKeag was one of the key players in this violence, and the year 1993 would prove to be one of the most lethal years yet in the history of the Troubles. This is the Troubles Podcast, a podcast which explores the violence and bloodshed that occurred in Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, and Great Britain, as multiple sides and organisations waged a bloody conflict over the status of Northern Ireland. We left things off towards the end of 1992, where the UDA had been making some significant gains. However, the year had not been without its difficulties. The UDA were now legally branded a terrorist organisation, to which Adair simply laughed when he was told. Republican paramilitaries were still determined to kill their leading members, and this was shown when the IPLO, the Irish People's Liberation Organisation, launched a deadly assault on the 16th of February 1992, killing young Protestant Andrew Johnson when the store he was working in was raked with gunfire. The Provisionals hadn't taken their eyes off the UDA and were determined to try and wipe them out. As the new year passed and the UDA moved into 1993, something unique was happening. It is well known that the tit-for-tat killing between the paramilitaries was stepping up in intensity, but something new and dangerous was starting. Loyalist and Republican paramilitaries are natural enemies, but as 1992 moved into 1993, there was a particular loathing between two sets of men, the UDA of Shankill and the Provisionals of the Ardoyne. This had now erupted into a deadly feud and seemed like a personal vendetta. When the men would cross paths with one another in a civilian setting, for example while out shopping with their wives, would hurl insults at one another, and there is at least one instance of one mocking the other's dead paramilitary friend. It's believed that this feud was because of the nature of the two commanders, the UDA's Johnny Adair and the Provisional IRA Eddie Bubbles Copeland. Copeland was, like McKeag, a very hard and fierce IRA man. His father was gunned down by British soldiers and he grew up in a provisional area. Both Copeland and Adair had a profound desire to see the other dead, yet throughout 1992, the only people who seemed to be getting killed were ordinary civilians. One RUC man stated that Copeland had sent multiple IRA teams to kill Adair, but Johnny always managed to escape, even when one IRA man opened fire on him while he was in his car. This RUC member stated that both men, by 1993, had lost count of how many times they tried to have the other killed. There was another man within the ranks of the Belfast Brigade that had become obsessed with Adair, and this was Brian Gillen. Like Copeland, Gillen was an extremely dangerous and tough man of few words. There is an instance where one journalist approached Gillen and asked him what he did for a living. He stared at the journalist and said, "I make car parks." This was a tongue-in-cheek reference to car parks being made after a building was flattened in a bomb. This feud between the two groups was one of the fundamental reasons C Company was so active. Strangely enough, the author of this episode can find no record of an attempt on McKeag's life, which is bizarre as he was a central figure to the C Company Brigade. On the 24th of March 1993, Peter Gallagher, a Sinn Féin supporter, was arriving to work at a building yard in West Belfast. Unbeknownst to him, McKeag was crouched in the bushes outside the workyard. McKeag pulled out a 9mm pistol and gunned down the young father of six. He then jumped on a pedal bike and cycled away from the scene, disposing of his gun on the way to Shankill. Once again, this inspired admiration from his colleagues, because he left the crime scene in such a brazen manner. 24 hours later, as the family of Peter Gallagher were in a stunned silence and grief of their loss, 17-year-old Damien Walsh was working in a fuel supply store on the outskirts of West Belfast when McKeag would strike again. He and another gunman crept up behind the teenager and pulled the trigger. This one wasn't as smooth as McKeag's previous ones. According to several witnesses, the gun at one point jammed, and Damien began to run. The gun then unclogged, and Damien was struck down after being hit several times. One witness who was working at the fuel shop claimed that the gunmen then tried to kill him, but the gun once again malfunctioned. The two gunmen then turned around and ran to a waiting car. Damien Walsh's mother, Miriam, gave a passionate response to her son's killing, saying, quote, "He was a typical wee lad. All he wanted to do was enjoy himself." The second gunman and the backup to McKeag claimed in an interview with David Lister that Walsh's name had been selected from a list of IRA suspects that had been passed on to members of C Company. The information on this list consisted of Walsh's date of birth and address. It was then claimed that he was a member of the IRA and was part of an active service unit. To give strength to this assertion, it was highlighted how the RUC had found more than 5 tons of fertiliser at the scene. In addition to this, the backup gunman, who named himself as Pete, claimed that the intelligence that they had in targeting Walsh had been analysed all night, 24 hours before the killing. Pete then talked about the direct aftermath of the killing, in which he asked, "Is it a hit or is it a hit?" And McKeag shouted back at him, "Aye, it's a hit, drive." Pete then said they sped off from the scene, playing loud rave music. He said, quote, "If you get somebody and they go down, you're elated and you're on a high. If you believe in what you're doing and that those bastards are killers, then you're on a high." McKeag was now becoming idolised on the Shankill as a man who would literally rise from his bed or walk away from a bar and go deep into enemy territory and kill. Only 2 months later, McKeag and another gunman stepped out of a stolen Ford Orion with automatic rifles and gunned down former Republican prisoner Alan Lundy, who was on the porch of Irish politician Alex Maskey's house. We can only guess that Maskey was the original target, but Lundy was, like so many others, in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Lundy fell to the floor, another gunman, either McKeag or the other, ran into the home to find Maskey, but this proved fruitless, as Maskey was hiding in the bathroom. Both gunmen then fled. This hit was celebrated by loyalists because they felt like they had gone into a Provo stronghold of Gartree and gunned down an IRA man and came very close to killing a well-known loyalist hate figure. During this period, men of C Company found themselves busier than ever, as McKeag's reputation continued to grow. After the Lundy murder, the UDA, using its satellite name, the UFF, stated that they intended to kill a prominent Sinn Féin councillor. At this point, they were determined not to be left out in the cold by the talks going on between the SDLP's John Hume and Gerry Adams, who, a week before the Lundy murder, had agreed on several factors that could lead to a ceasefire. One of those critical factors between Hume and Adams was that the Irish people had a right to national self-determination. To the Loyalists, this was the final proof of their ancient suspicion that they would be betrayed by all parties, including Downing Street. In the psyche of the Loyalists' mind, the talks between Hume and Adams were confirmation that the Pan-Nationalist Front had something going on up their sleeve. Under Adair's command, McKeag and his C Company in that summer of 1993 were going out of their way to launch attacks against the nationalist community and politicians. There was a grenade attack on the home of Sinn Féin councillor Gerard McGuigan on the 17th of May. Then the Sinn Féin Advice Centre in the New Lodge area of North Belfast was fired upon by loyalist Jamie Hill. The intended targets were Bobby Lavery and Dennis O'Hagan. However, this attempted hit didn't go to plan. Unbeknownst to Jamie Hill, a British soldier was standing atop an observation post and witnessed the attack. The soldier then shouldered his rifle, looked down his scope and fired off multiple rounds, hitting Jamie Hill and his brother as they attempted to drive away. They then discovered the wounded Jamie in an alleyway lying in a pool of blood, while his brother was found hiding in a house. Both men were sentenced to 16 years each for their role in this attack. However, C Company were not deterred by this failure. On the 8th of June, Gerry Adams had his home attacked by a grenade, as loyalists were stepping up their gun attacks across the city. Many in C Company were now being startled by the sheer intensity of their campaign against the PNF. One C Company man, speaking anonymously to David Lister, said, quote, "It was relentless, and we thought that it was the only thing that was going to prevent Protestants getting slotted." This man said that for the first time they were having a real psychological effect on the provisional IRA, and that many of them were now sleeping in safe houses and putting their couches up behind the door. And it was Stephen Top Gun McKeag who was at the centre of this chaos. On the 8th of August at 9 p.m, McKeag and another gunman were outside the home of Sinn Féin councillor Bobby Lavery, who had already suffered at the hands of loyalists when his brother was killed by the UVF. Bobby had been the victim of multiple attempts on his life, and tonight there would be another one. But on this night, it would be his 21-year-old son, Sean Lavery, who would be killed in a hail of gunfire as McKeag and another man fired over 20 rounds into his home. Bobby would later say of this murder that the UDA was trying to wipe his entire family out. Stephen McKeag was now, it seemed to those around him, on an unstoppable rampage, and with each hit his reputation grew and grew. By this point in his life, he was now considered a hero on the Shankill. He was as feared as he was respected, and the killings seemed to, at least on the surface, have no effect on him. But he was changing. He was now fanatical about lifting weights. He had acquired some peculiar habits, such as keeping exotic animals, snakes and reptiles, and at one point he had a fierce argument with his girlfriend Tracy because he wanted a monkey. He was now a father of 4 to 4 different women, and in a fashion that many people would call bizarre. Both of his boys were called Stephen, and both of his daughters were called Stephanie. He was often in that year racing around the Shankill on his motorcycle, or behind a set of decks playing trance and rave music. 3 weeks after the attempted assassination of Bobby Lavery, McKeag killed Maria Teresa Dowds de Mulligan. She was in the kitchen of her home when, according to multiple sources, McKeag raised a rifle, firing through the small window and shooting her in the head and neck. She died instantly. Strangely enough, the UDA were silent in the wake of this hit, as nobody seemed willing to come forward to claim it. But it was only under the duress of Adair that the UDA, once again using the satellite name the UFF, claimed that the real target had been Marie's husband, Maximo, and they regretted the night's tragic events. This regret didn't stop them though, and on the 7th of September, McKeag, with another man, walked into the John David Hair Salon, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap. He pointed his pistol at the man behind the desk and fired several shots into him. And as the man lay on the floor, McKeag stood over him and fired more rounds into his head. The man killed was 40-year-old Sean Hughes, who had owned the salon for nearly 20 years. But he wasn't the man they were meant to kill. Sean Hughes was the wrong target, as the original target was an INLA man called Frankie Lanigan. In the direct aftermath of this shooting, McKeag then walked out of the saloon, laughing, and turned to a woman who was sobbing outside on the pavement. He went right into her face and burst out into song, "Follow the Yellow Brick Road." He then walked into his car with his fellow hitman, laughing. The Yellow Brick Road was McKeag's nickname for Lanark Way, which was a street which linked Shankill and Springfield roads. Pete, a former C Company man and friend of McKeag, said, quote, "She was screaming hysterical in the street and he was just singing in her face. It was the middle of the afternoon and the place was packed. But that was Stevie, he was just totally focused." McKeag's attacks were recognised at an awards ceremony which was usually held in a pub called the Berlin Arms on the Shankill Road, but which had now been moved to the Diamond Jubilee Bar, and one peculiar thing happened there in mid-1993. Everyone was expecting an ordinary night when the doors to the bar flew open and 4 masked men came in carrying AKs and light machine gun, with a belt of bullets attached, and the other 2 men carrying Israeli Uzis. It was Johnny Adair. Everyone in the room was silent as Adair walked through the crowd and onto the stage in the pub to give out 7 plaques for the men who carried out operations, and Stephen McKeag was called up to the stage amidst cheers from C Company men for his role. It was there Adair gave him the award of Top Gun, for essentially committing the most brutal killings that year. According to one source, quote, "Stevie would always get the Top Gun award." Hence, with his award, McKeag's nickname was now cemented, and the title would follow him everywhere he went. This event, which one newspaper called the macabre ghoulish Oscars, soon became a smooth-running affair with a buffet, music, drinks, and prizes to be gifted out, whilst Tina Turner's Simply the Best would blast out over the speakers. And despite the change in procedure, if one thing was to stay the same, it would be that McKeag would win the award Top Gun, for which his friends would cheer. But this wouldn't last. As the bloody year of 1993 was drawing to a close, McKeag was the new commander of his unit, and one of his last targets of the year was 23-year-old Paddy McMahon. It is alleged that Paddy McMahon was gunned down in a hail of bullets in front of his girlfriend and child, and McKeag was the man who was pulling the trigger. He then escaped by climbing down a drain pipe and then moving on foot to the Loyalist Tiger Bay. As 1993 was drawing to a close, C Company and the UDA as a whole had done something that they hadn't done before. They had at this point begun to outkill the IRA, but the Provisional IRA weren't sitting idle, and the feud that whirled around McKeag between the men of Ardoyne and the men of Shankill would reach an awful crescendo when on the 23rd of October that year, two Ardoyne IRA members, Thomas Begley and Sean Kelly, walked into Frizzell's fish shop, which lay underneath the UDA command centre. Whilst Kelly held up the chip shop, Begley's explosive device detonated prematurely, and an enormous explosion ripped through the Shankill Road. The blast was so powerful that the entire building was turned into rubble. 9 people were killed, either by the force of the explosion or the collapse of the building. Frizzell's fish shop was chosen by the Ardoyne Brigade of the IRA because the UDA command centre was above the fish shop, and blowing it up would be seen as a decapitation of the UDA leadership. However, as fate would have it, Adair and his close associates had left the UDA command centre earlier that morning via the back entrance. The response to this bombing was shock and condemnation. It was horrifyingly clear that the Ardoyne IRA had not cut the head off the UDA leadership, but that they had just slaughtered ordinary people who were wanting to get food and do some shopping. Several hours after the bombing, the UDA issued this ominous warning, quote, "From 6 p.m, all brigade active service units of the UFF across Ulster will be mobilised. John Hume, Gerry Adams and the nationalist electorate will pay a heavy, heavy price for today's atrocity, which was signed, sealed and delivered by the cutting edge of the pan-nationalist front. To the perpetrators of this atrocity, you will have no hiding place. Time is on our side. And to John Hume, we ask, is this your peace?" It was now abundantly clear that the violence that had been happening in the late 70s and early 80s was resurging in 1993. According to various sources, Adair, with McKeag at his side, went on a mission for a bloody reprisal. There was even talk of slaughtering Catholics as they left the church after Mass, but this was then abandoned when they realised that it would be a disastrous PR move. So they put their plans into motion to move against the nationalist community. Revenge was swift, as the UDA and UVF went on a wave of killings. Yet the final act of revenge would come on the night of the 30th of October, when people were drinking in the Rising Sun bar in the quiet village of Greysteel, which lay close to the shore of the Lough Foyle. People were laughing and joking when 2 men walked into the bar and shouted, "Trick or treat," before opening fire on the revellers with an AK-47 and an automatic pistol. After 3 minutes, the men withdrew to a getaway car and drove away into the night, leaving behind them a room clouded in gunsmoke with bodies strewn everywhere. This would go on to be called the Greysteel massacre and would claim the lives of 8 people, 6 Catholics and 2 Protestants. Just a quick note to say that if you are enjoying this podcast and want to support it, you can do so over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. I've been filling up the private Patreon feed for over 3 years now and have a huge amount of Patreon exclusive content for you to check out. Each episode gets its own companion video where I talk about what's happening in Northern Ireland right now, as well as some additional details that came up after the release of the episode. I also have some Patreon-only episodes, such as one all about the Troubles in popular culture and the songs that came out of that period. And just last week, I released a Patreon-exclusive interview with Kevin Owens, who was in the Irish Army patrolling the Irish border in the 90s, and he had some very interesting stories to tell. If you have been enjoying this podcast over the last few seasons and would like to help me turn this into a full-time job, you can do so over at patreon.com/The Troubles Podcast. Thank you. At this point, it seemed that a black shadow had come over Northern Ireland. In that 1 week during the Greysteel massacre, there was absolute chaos, with 23 people being killed. There was an atmosphere of despair in the air. And this was crystallised when John Hume wept openly at the graveside of the Greysteel victims and looked somewhat broken. The UDA gunman, Geoffrey Deeney, who participated in the Greysteel massacre, would later say, quote, "I never felt remorse about what I did. We were using IRA tactics against IRA. It was Old Testament justice, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." McKeag had no part in this atrocity, but for him, his number was nearly up. After what can only be described as a one-man crusade against the nationalist community for over 18 months. The RUC were closing in on him, and despite the accolades of his peers, the money and the women, it all came to an end when he was arrested in connection with the murder of Sean Hughes. By November, McKeag was one of the most feared and prolific killers to ever come from the ranks of loyalism. His friend Peter said, quote, "You can put Stevie down for about 14 hits. It became common knowledge how many hits people had done. People get associated with numbers rather than operations, and everyone knew Stevie did 14. he set the standard. As McKeag went to jail, the title of C Company commander passed on to Gary Smickers Smith. So what after this? Well, the UDA, after the carnage of 1992 and 1993, along with the UVF, entered an uncertain cold ceasefire with the IRA. The two didn't like and they didn't trust each other, but for now, they would try and stop slaughtering each other. But before this ceasefire took effect, the Provisionals once again displayed the famous trait of not letting anything go unpunished. On the 31st of July 1994, UDA commanders Joe Bratty and Raymond Elder, who had helped orchestrate the Sean Graham's betting shop massacre, were drinking in a loyalist band hall when they finished their drinks and headed outside. Unbeknownst to them, several Provisional IRA members were waiting behind a van ready to settle a very old and very bloody score. When Bratty and Elder emerged in the streets, they were greeted with the sight of several gunmen, all wearing white boiler suits and black ski masks, armed with rifles and pistols. Both Bratty and Elder were riddled with bullets, and the noise of it made everyone pause in the surrounding streets. To leave nothing to doubt, the gunmen then stepped forward and emptied their magazines into both men. The news of the death of Bratty and Elder was greeted with a sigh of relief by many Catholics of South Belfast, even though they were against the armed violence of the Provisionals. Both men had terrorised the community and had a profound hate of Catholics. Bratty even had a tattoo of the KKK on his hand. There have even been unsubstantiated rumours that some members of the loyalist community felt mild relief as well, due to both men being feared and posing a danger to their own. On August 4th, the Belfast Brigade of the Provisionals would say in a scathing issue of Unpublished, quote, "Volunteers under our command executed Joe Bratty and Raymond Elder in a carefully planned operation last Sunday evening, 31st of July. Bratty was the UDA's commanding officer and also a member of the UDA Inner Council. Both Bratty and Elder planned and controlled the murder of a large number of nationalists in the Ormeau Road and surrounding. Then a month to the day after this killing, the ceasefire of 1994 began. All the while, McKeag remained in prison, and in his research for this episode, the author has found very few details of McKeag's time spent there. But when he was finally released from prison in 1997, things began to unravel. He resumed once again his position as military commander of C Company, but then two things happened. The first was the murder of Billy Wright in the Maze prison at the hands of the INLA. According to Henry MacDonald in Deadly Enemies, McKeag, upon hearing of the death of Billy Wright, went berserk and began to openly call for immediate revenge. He then went out and carried out what many believe was his final hit. 4 days after Billy Wright had been murdered, McKeag and another backup gunman strode up to the Clifton Tavern, which lay on the Belfast-Cliftonville Road, and McKeag shouted, "All right, lads," and opened fire on the patrons and doormen stood outside with an Uzi. Edmund Traynor, a 31-year-old Catholic civil servant, was killed instantly, and 7 others were wounded. McKeag and the other gunman then fled in a hijacked car. This killing was not warmly received by all factions of loyalism, so much so that the Loyalist Military Command and other brigadiers pulled McKeag in for questioning and had words with him for jeopardising the ceasefire. According to one witness, McKeag remained unflappable and sternly told the men in the room that he was acting within the rules of Loyalist protocol and that Loyalists had the right to retaliate. His reputation was so significant that many of the senior commanders essentially backed down and McKeag walked away unperturbed. The next significant incident in McKeag's life would be his first step towards his demise. It was well known that he loved motorcycles, and one day in early June 1998, he was racing through the streets of Belfast when he collided with a car. The crash was described as devastating, and it was a medical marvel that McKeag wasn't killed outright. In a bitter twist of irony, the car that was written off had been driven by a UVF man. This was a crippling blow to McKeag, who spent weeks bedbound, receiving round-the-clock care, suffering multiple broken bones, a punctured lung, and ruptured organs. According to one source, when he woke and couldn't speak, the first thing he did was ask for a pen, and he wrote, "Up the UDA." The effect this crash had on him was profound. He was, in the eyes of some of his colleagues, a shadow of his former self, suffering excruciating pain and being rendered immobile, and some joked that now he was the bionic man. However, brevity aside, many were startled at the difference in the man who only 6 years prior was riding up and down the Shankill Road, dangerous, muscular and confident. But now it was different. As the years passed, McKeag became heavily reliant upon powerful opioids to manage his pain. But there was another change. The phenomena of cocaine and drug dealing were at this point of the decade still a new novelty. However, according to David Lister and Hugh Jordan's Mad Dog, McKeag was now chief C Company dealer, and unable to, as he once had, leap out and kill upon request, he threw his caution to the wind and began to use cocaine heavily. His involvement in the procuring and distribution of drugs was evident in his extravagant purchases that he made. He purchased a high-end caravan, a huge sound system to which he would play and mix music, cars, and motorbikes. All is well known that McKeag worshipped Adair, and his loyalty was shown by the amount of times he went out to kill at his bidding. But as is always the case in the violent world of paramilitaries, the skills and reasons that someone is loved and admired for one day can be the very things that they are hated for the next. When Johnny Adair was released from jail, according to one source, Adair, Winky Dodds and McKeag went to a gala dinner for the LVF in Lurgan in 1999. At one point, Adair was called up to the stage, and there was a loud cheer from the crowd. But next, McKeag was called up, and when the crowd heard the name Top Gun, there was a deafening roar. As Winky Dodds later recounted, the roof nearly came off when Stevie got called up. Dodds described seeing Adair's face drop. Many within C Company later claimed that it was McKeag who created Johnny Adair, not the other way round. Winky Dodds claimed that when Adair came out of prison, he didn't want to be reminded that he was not the legend he used to be. This envy of McKeag was then made further evident when a few months later at the annual UDA Awards, McKeag was called up for another award. Gary Smickers Smith, who was sitting in the audience, screamed, "What about me?" The walls around Top Gun were beginning to close in, and the next significant blow in his life would come when he and Adair would fall out over a woman. At this time, McKeag had been with his girlfriend Tracy Coulter, and Tracy's father, Jackie, believed that McKeag was beating her. He raised his concerns to Johnny Adair and asked him to do something about it. Lister and Jordan then write that things took an unexpected turn when Adair is alleged to have begun sleeping with Tracy Coulter. It's believed that this then led to a heated argument between both men, with both expressing threats to kill one another. It was evident to everyone in the room that the early days of the friendship when they would dress alike and drink side by side was over. A few days after this, McKeag then would be embroiled as he went to a woman's defence while drinking in a loyalist bar, which resulted in a brawl. His popularity amongst some of the UDA men certainly was waning. Then, in a final humiliating blow, a short time later, UDA men went around to McKeag and dragged him out onto the green of Florence Court, where he was subjected to a vicious beating. Then in early 2000, he was ordered to leave the Shankill by Adair. This had a devastating effect on McKeag, as he allegedly went to one friend pleading with him to speak to the wee fella, speaking of Adair. McKeag was now an outsider and an outcast, spending most of his days in a girlfriend's flat or in his caravan. By the summer of 2000, it seemed that his luck had begun to turn, and against all odds, he'd been asked to come back to the Shankill by Adair. This wasn't a gesture of reconciliation, as Adair's C Company was now locked in a deadly feud with the UVF, and Adair would need all the help he could get. McKeag then informed them that he would not partake in any feud and he would not use a gun to kill other loyalists. And so, being no use to them, he was relocated back to Florence Court. Steve Top Gun McKeag died in his home on the 24th of September 2000. He was found wearing boxer shorts, face down, with his body covered in bruises. A bath was running and a crossbow bolt was lodged in a wall. Mystery and intrigue surround his death, as some have claimed that he was beaten to death and had a lethal dose of cocaine forced down his throat. Others think that his body had simply succumbed to the deadly cocktail of drugs, opioids and cocaine that toxicology reports showed. McKeag is remembered and indeed idolised in loyalist myth, and he even has his own mural on display on the side of a home on the Shankill Road in Belfast. One loyalist called him their own Indiana Jones. Damien Walsh's mother claimed that her son was stolen from her by McKeag, and some have stated that McKeag's violence may have been able to be stopped years before his death, as a report into his death highlighted an exhaustive catalogue of RUC and British intelligence failings, raising the ugly spectre of collusion once more. Whatever the case, to those who have listened to this episode, and all the horror and grief it entails, we have to make sure that whether loyalist or nationalist, that the dark days of the 90s will always remain solely in our history books and are never again realities. That's it from me. Thanks, and see you next time. This episode was written by John Livingstone. Johnny has a master's degree in international relations and has been studying the Troubles for 10 years. If you want to read more of his writing, you can do so over at The Troubles Archive on Instagram.